In this video, I want to talk about this phenomena that's becoming increasingly common, particularly online. It's this practice of agnostics calling themselves atheists. I want to explore that a little bit and then answer the question, should we care about it? So, first of all, let's talk about how the term atheism has historically been defined. And the way that atheism has historically been defined is captured in this definition from Paul Edwards, drawn from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Edwards writes, according to the most usual definition, an atheist is a person who maintains that there is no God. That is, that the sentence, God exists, expresses a false proposition. In contrast, an agnostic maintains that it is not known or cannot be known whether there is a God. That is, whether the sentence God exists expresses a true proposition. So, clear definition there between atheist and agnostic. An atheist believes the sentence God exists is false. The agnostic does not believe it is true or false. Now, Edwards also adds this. On our definition, an atheist is a person who rejects belief in God, regardless of whether or not his reason for the rejection is the claim that God exists expresses a false proposition. Now, what he's saying there is that atheism is also consistent with the view, which was popular in the middle of the 20th century, coming out of logical positivism, that said statements about God are literally meaningless. They're not bearers of truth or falsity. So, to conclude, on Edwards' view, you could be an atheist if A, you believe the sentence God exists is false, or B, you believe it is meaningless, that it carries no meaning at all. But if you withhold belief in God's existence, if you just don't have that belief, but you also don't have belief in the falsity of that proposition or sentence, then you're an agnostic. You're not an atheist. That's the traditional view. Now, in terms of agnostic, we could also take a look at the current Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. An agnostic is a person who has entertained the proposition that there is a God, but believes neither that it is true nor that it is false. I like this definition of agnosticism better than the one in the previous slide, where Edwards describes it more strongly as nobody can know. Here it's a more modest claim, which is representative of a wider swath of agnostics, people who simply don't have a belief about the truth or falsity of the proposition God exists, but they don't necessarily commit themselves to the stronger claim that it cannot be known or reasonably believed, whether God exists or not. So that's atheism and agnosticism as traditionally defined. So what's going on here? Well, what we're now seeing increasingly are people who call themselves atheists, but they actually say, oh, no, I'm not saying that God does not exist or that I believe God does not exist. I'm not saying I believe the proposition God exists is false. All I'm saying is that I'm without belief in God. For example, atheism, a lack of belief in the existence of God or gods. And then this individual goes on to say, that is the entire meaning of atheism. So atheism is simply this view that one is without belief in God, not that one actually positively believes there is no God. So here's an interesting question. Why is this happening? What explains this current trend, particularly in the online infidel or skeptic community, to call themselves atheists in this manner when really they are taking a stance that is equivalent with the historic definition of agnosticism? Well, I'm going to surmise a little bit, some suggestions, and if you are an atheist, you might not like my suggestions, but I'm okay with that. You're free to share your own explanations as to why you do it down below. So here's an example. One point to make to begin is that defending atheism is hard work. Defending the claim that there is no God or that the proposition God exists is false, you actually have to have some evidence to support that. And frankly, there are a lot of people that I think have kind of found their way into atheism on the cheap, as it were, that they don't actually have well-formed arguments to support the label atheism as historically defined, So when you kind of push them and ask them, well, what evidence do you have for your view? That's when they kind of retreat at that point and say, well, I'm without belief in God. And that doesn't have the same kind of evidential burden as making the positive claim that God does not exist, or that the proposition God exists is false. So I don't have to defend anything. There is, related to that, in my view, a second phenomena that is at play here. The second view is that, in my experience, I think atheism as a term or a label, it has a certain cultural cachet that agnosticism simply does not have. Now, I know that there are some atheists who really don't like me saying that, and they say, well, when I became an atheist, and when I took on that label, my parents were angry and so disappointed, and it created a huge rift in my family, and I was alienated from all sorts of people. I didn't have any reason, any common benefit to call myself an atheist. It just hurt my Christian family or my religious family even more than if I had just called myself an agnostic. Okay, fair enough. I mean, I'm not disputing every case, but I will point out that I do think for some people, and really for many people who are part of the skeptic atheist community, that there is a communal identity and a resonance with the term atheist that simply does not go along with agnostic. That in particular subcultures, such as a skeptic subculture or a humanist subculture or an avowedly atheist subculture, to call yourself an atheist has a positive connotation that it doesn't have in the wider culture. Just like calling yourself an evangelical Christian can actually have a lot of stigma and baggage in the wider culture, but within the relevant religious subculture, it can be a very positive ascription. So when people want to identify fully with the new community that they've adopted, they've now left their religious community behind, they want to find themselves identifying with an atheist skeptic community, well, then they've got a good motivation themselves to adopt the word atheist for themselves, whether or not they are able to commit to the proposition that God does not exist. I think as well here, in terms of the cultural cachet, that there is something analogous to a fellow who, he says, well, I'm a combat veteran. And then you say, oh, really, where did you serve? In what war? And he says, oh, I haven't served in any war. I just was in the National Guard for a time. And I would go out to the local base and do some training exercises. And you would say, well, but that's not what combat veteran means. And then that person might say, well, I use combat veteran in a broader sense to refer to anybody who was in the National Guard, even if they've never actually seen combat. And they might be doing that for a reason that would include taking on the additional cultural cachet of declaring themselves a combat veteran. And analogously, a person who is not able or committed to defending the proposition that God does not exist, but who wants to identify themselves as an atheist within their new belief community, well, they might well have a motivation for then calling themselves an atheist. So who cares? In one sense, it's like if people want to call themselves an atheist when they're really historically an agnostic, then I can say, fine, it's a free country, go ahead and do that. I think sometimes people get into these endless terminological battles, and the reality is that if people want to use language in a new way, they're free to do so. The language changes meaning over time, and it may eventually get to the point where atheist, with this extended meaning, is well established in common usage. And in that point, there's no sense kicking against the goads and cursing the evolution and development of language. As long, I want to add, as people understand what you're saying, that what you're actually endorsing is a position historically defined as agnosticism. As long as people are clear about that, then you can call yourself whatever you want, but let's just be sure that we're not talking past one another. Having said that, I want to add one final big but. The final but I have is a concern that even though it may be the fact that we cannot prevent and stop this new evolution of the word atheist to encompass people who are historically defined as agnostics, I still want to raise a few different complaints about that. And I'm going to conclude this little video with those complaints. The first one is that it is pretty clear that this evolution, this change, this development involves conflation. I think generally speaking, when concepts are clarified and distinguished, that's a good evolution or development of language. But when you lose distinctions in language and concepts that were once clearly distinct now become conflated, I think that's a negative development, all things considered. And this is an example of that. If the word atheist now comes to mean both people who just are without belief in God, historically defined as agnostic, as well as people who believe God does not exist, historically defined as atheist, then we've lost a clarity of conceptual distinction that we previously had. And I think that is an objective deficit. It's a loss. So I would want to say, let's keep using agnostics for the one group and atheists for the other group. Now, there is a rejoinder here at this point. Some people might say, well, okay, how about I stipulate that I'm not just an atheist, but I'm a weak atheist or a soft atheist. And so here, weak or soft atheism is the subset of atheists who believe that they're just simply without belief in God. And there's another subset of atheists, maybe they are hard or strong atheists, and they actually believe God does not exist. And the general label atheist would encompass both of these groups. Okay, but why not just stick with atheist and agnostic? I mean, I think those are perfectly serviceable terms in their historic definition. Agnostic was a great term. I thank T.H. Huxley for coming up with it. I don't think that weak or soft atheisms are an improvement on agnosticism. And there's one more thing I want to just raise at the very end, that we have to be careful how we define weak atheism, because it could lead to nonsense. I'll just put it very simply like this. Some so-called weak atheists say, well, if you find yourself without belief in the proposition that God exists, you can call yourself a weak atheist. But then by that logic, if you find yourself without belief in the non-existence of God, you could call yourself a weak theist. And since you could be simultaneously both without belief in the existence of God and without belief in the non-existence of God, you could simultaneously be a weak theist and a weak atheist, which is just sort of nonsense. You can't simultaneously be a theist and an atheist. And if you're going to begin to use language such that it has that implication, I'm going to say that is indeed an objective decline in our ability to use language to clarify concepts and speak clearly with one another. So to conclude, I want to suggest at the end of the day, let's get away from this whole business about calling yourself an atheist when you're really an agnostic. We've got perfectly good terminology already established through centuries and decades of usage. Let's not muddy the waters by calling ourselves atheists or weak or soft atheists when we are in fact agnostics.